Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. It's the end of September. Every year since the 1940s, the end of September has been United Nations really month. It was first a week and then it increased as the number of countries increased. Every head of state, head of government has to make a intervention at the UN. So naturally, the week became 2 weeks and so on. A very important time of year, a lot of agenda setting for the United Nations. Zoe, you are in New York. You've been in and around the UN during the General Assembly meeting. What's been happening at the UN General Assembly?
Well, Vijay, as you said, it's a very lively week. There's all sorts of different summits, the General Assembly itself, but then all of the bilateral meetings that take place, the different think tanks that have their sort of meetings around the General Assembly. So it's again, all sorts of diplomats, NGO people have all really descended upon the city. Crazy traffic, of course. But it has been quite notable in the sense of this past weekend, the G77 group was meeting, of course, in Havana, Cuba, discussing some of the key issues that would be brought up this week in the UNGA and in the different sort of meetings. Monday and Tuesday, as we reported on at People's Dispatch, and Vijay, you talked about this, about the Sustainable Development Goals, this sort of empty promises to kind of trying to, of course, make significant development in a lot of the countries of the world that need it. But again, as many of these countries have rightly pointed out, both in the Sustainable Development Goals Summit and in their speeches at the UNGA, not only are they suffering from the impacts of climate change, not only are they saddled with so much debt, but the entire, and of course, maybe because of this, the entire international financial system essentially makes it impossible for these countries to really and significantly take forward their development and have any chance of even reaching these goals. So that's been something on the table. A lot of different leaders have even named neoliberalism. I think we really have to take account and take stock of the fact that it is a different moment. People are talking about inequality, but talking about it in a specific way. Again, climate is, of course, at the front of people's agendas. A lot of the different representatives from the small island nations, of course, spoke about this and the importance of global north countries taking action to climate financing. The war in Ukraine, of course, continues to remain an item on the agenda. And another really interesting, or rather important, issue would be that of Haiti. We know that this is being discussed in different spaces at the UN. There has been numerous statements by UN officials over the past year about the situation in Haiti, expressing concern over the increase in gang violence and the institutional breakdown. However, Kenya has already sent this alleged peacekeeping mission. There's very difficult situation there because we know that the legacy of the UN in Haiti is one that is violent, that is very traumatic. The UN peacekeeping missions that were in Haiti for over a decade caused a horrible cholera outbreak. It was responsible for so many different human rights violations. Won't even go into all of these. You can read it on People's Dispatch. We've covered this extensively, and interviews with Haitian leaders discussing the MINUSTA. And so now that it's back on the table, organizations in Haiti and really, human rights activists across the world are very, very concerned about this possibility of what a new UN peacekeeping mission could look like, how will it be configured, and the fact that the situation in Haiti right now is really caused is a product of imperialist intervention in the country and not allowing the country to actually build itself up, meet these sustainable development goals, but also really have autonomy over its politics. So really, that debate is definitely going to be very intense. and we'll definitely be following it.
Inclusive of the UN talks around Haiti, the discussions at the UN about other big issues, war, issues of climate change, and so on. There have been several side meetings of importance, I think, that we should pay attention to. One of the side meetings was, as I said, around the issue of the climate and climate change. Let's track a little bit in order to understand this. Let's track a little bit what the United States climate czar, John Kerry, has been up to in this period. It's pretty revealing to understand how the United States has been operating on the issue of climate, just in order to get a big picture. Before the UN General Assembly came together, before the UN Climate Summit, Mr. Kerry had been making a number of statements, some pretty strong, about oil and natural gas companies, saying that, they have to step up. They are continuing to drill. They are not concerned about making a transition to clean energy and so on. He made some pretty strong statements beforehand. There's a good reason why Mr. Kerry did this. In about 3 months, in the United Arab Emirates, COP28 will be held, which some people are calling the oil COP. It's an unfortunate designation, actually, but there's something to it, because the Dubai-led team that's running COP28 has said that they want to directly engage oil and natural gas companies to think again about setting targets, not 2050 targets, but maybe even 2030 targets. It has to be said that COP meetings in the last several years have been heavily funded by oil and natural gas companies. So it's not like they've been sitting outside looking in. I mean, they not only are big participants in setting the agenda, but they also happen to pay for it. Who pays the piper calls the tune. So Mr. Kerry's statements about oil and natural gas companies, to some extent, welcome, because it's true. Somebody needs to tell these big companies that they need to pull it together. Interestingly, when it came down to it at the climate summit and in the outside in the halls, Mr. Kerry once again launched an attack on India, China, and other countries, saying, why are they increasing coal? This has become the tagline, this question of India, China, and others using coal. The question is, why are they not making the transition? Now, if we look at the facts, it's pretty clear that Mr. Kerry is being a little malicious here. In terms of renewable energy, United States, about 13% of its energy needs comes from renewable energy. China, 14% of their energy needs comes from renewable energy. So it's not like the Chinese are doing so much worse. Now it's a much bigger country, more energy is used and so on. But nonetheless, it's not like they are not, trying to do this transition. When you look at the data on the 5 countries that are emitting more than their carbon budget based on a per capita calculation, the 5 top emitting countries in the world are the United States, Germany, Russia, United Kingdom, and Japan. And in fact, a new study suggests that these countries owe the countries of the global south not $100 billion in the climate fund, but $131 trillion. Okay, just imagine that number. $131 trillion is what is owed. A new study has suggested. Now, what's interesting is in Britain this week, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has decided to suspend the urgency of the climate debate. He made a press conference where he said, we're not going to meet the targets. We're going to push them further along. He made a good point, though. He said that Britain is not a major emitter in volume terms. So if Britain cuts its carbon budget fast, it's not going to make a huge impact. In fact, India could make the same argument Mr. Sunak made. India contributes about 4% into the excess carbon. If India today just stopped working and everything in India closed down, that wouldn't actually impact the 1.5 degree threshold all that much. There are major emitters. United States is a very large emitter. Germany, Europe in general. They are just not stepping up. And in fact, Britain has given new licenses for oil and natural gas drilling in the North Sea. When Mr. Kerry was asked about that, he said that's not our agenda. But that's not, in fact, entirely true. United States also opening up new oil fields across the country, including in Alaska. Things are being looked at. The climate debate continues to be stalemated between the West refusing to acknowledge its excess carbon role and refusing to pay compensation. Forget 131 trillion, not even 100 billion. And meanwhile, of course, countries like India and China struggling between meeting carbon obligations and also development. This is a debate that is going to run now from this UN climate summit all the way to Dubai at COP28. We're going to follow this, of course, pretty closely. Other kind of agreements in the planet, Prashant, some in the Sahel. What's happening there?
Right. We're talking about what is being called the Alliance of Sahel States, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso signing what is an agreement in the capital, Bamako, in Mali's capital, Bamako, actually. Very interesting agreement at this point of time, what is called the Liptako-Gorma Charter, that's reference to the border region between these countries. And it comes at a time when, as we know, all of these countries have had coups. The coup in Niger was the latest. It's about 2 months since that coup. And Niger, of course, has been facing a lot of pressure. We'll come to that in a bit, but has sort of refused to sort of give in on most counts. In fact, they've taken a very strong position against the French. We know that the French ambassador was embattled or pretty much besieged. The negotiations are supposedly going on for the eviction of all French soldiers as well. And Mali and Burkina Faso have already taken that step as well. So in that way, it's kind of natural that these three states come together and sign an agreement and form an alliance, which kind of represents that. And it's kind of also interesting because it in some ways follows on a tradition which I think a lot of which is kind of maybe lost in the past, where many countries in that region at various points did consider, federations or federating themselves to various extents. That was actually a part of the anti-colonial agenda as well. The fact that the boundaries between many of these countries do not really make sense at all. And there is a need for many of these countries to work closer together in whatever capacity possible, in a more united way, to actually transcend some of the divisions caused by colonialism. So the Alliance of Sahel States in some senses also maybe or potentially serving as a milestone in that aspect as well. But I think also equally importantly is the fact that there is definitely a strong security concern, and the security concern is two aspects to it. One, there is the issue of insurgency, which is especially peaked in Mali in recent times, and all these countries have faced that in various extents. Now, this insurgency was used by France in the past, which sort of claimed that it would play the role of this kind of neutral arbiter or whatever and come and suppress it for their erstwhile colonies. But just as we talked about in Haiti, the experience of the people when French soldiers was there was quite bad. Not only the French soldiers failed to achieve those objectives, there were many cases of various human rights violations, atrocities, etc., which really made the people angry, and that served as a huge spur for the kind of coups that took place in these countries against the French presence. So now, of course, they have evicted the French, but the issue of the insurgency remains. And while it is a complex issue, nonetheless, the fact that it is an immediate issue as well of the fighting that is going on over there. So I think that is definitely one aspect. The other aspect where security comes in really is the fact that Mali and Burkina Faso have earlier declared that an attack on Niger would be considered as an attack on them as well. And in that sense, what this alliance does is also sort of strengthen the commitment that these two countries have made to each other. We know that the government of Niger, for instance, has given the authorization for Mali and Burkina Faso to deploy their forces in the event of an invasion. We know that ECOWAS not only discussed invasion but also talked about a D-Day which had been decided for the invasion to take place. And at that point of time, the fact that there were internal disagreements within ECOWAS was a major reason why there was no intervention at that point of time as well. And even now, the possibility of an ECOWAS military intervention is not over. We still have, various leaders of the region talking, once in a while, sort of mentioning that and saying it's not off the table, but we're still giving diplomacy a last chance, etc., etc. So, in that sense, too, this kind of an alliance, which is as much a security alliance, has a very powerful significance. So we're talking about 2 or 3 dimensions of what this alliance of Sahel states would mean. We know that Mali did a constitutional referendum which actually sought to transcend some of the say limitations placed by the colonial structures and the post-colonial governments. So whether this kind of tendency picks up is something that will be interesting to see. We know that the leader of Burkina Faso, for instance, has on international platforms talked about the need to combat imperialism in various forms. So all of these are very interesting trends need to be followed. Finally, just conclude with the fact that Bola Tinubu, the Nigerian president in the United Nations, said that all these coups do not indicate that there is support for coups, but that there are these pressing issues to be solved. But the question really is that do the governments of ECOWAS today have the capacity to solve these pressing issues? I think is really the question which is not addressed.
Not addressed either for many global South countries. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch, Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Zoe, can government solve things? You got elections in Ecuador, elections in Argentina. Luisa Gonzalez, point position in Ecuador. What's the agenda? Can they solve things?
Well, in mid-October, we're going to see 2 electoral processes, which are very, very important. And in this past week, actually, the presidential candidate, Luisa Gonzalez of Ecuador, actually made a public statement saying that there had been an assassination attempt against her. We'll get back to that. But the people of Argentina are going to head to the polls on October 22nd. People of Ecuador, second round of the elections on October 15th. These, again, are very crucial elections. 2 countries mired in economic crisis, insecurity crisis, in a political crisis, and really reflecting the trends of the region of this polarization, rising insecurity, rising crime. And in Argentina, of course, you have the factor of this rising right wing. But both are countries that have been really destroyed by IMF policies, by neoliberalism in the past several years. In Ecuador, in the second round of elections, again, Luisa Gonzalez, who denounced that there was a threat against her life. Those people have been arrested, but she polled ahead of the other candidates in the first round of the elections. The question is, will she be able to galvanize enough support from other sectors to actually put her across the threshold? Or will it happen like it did in 2021, where Andrés Arauz was unable to carry forward his first round victory to a second round victory? This is a crucial issue. And as you can hear in the debate that took place before the first round, and really the main topic that people in Ecuador are talking about is this issue of crime, is this issue of violence. What is the perspective of the left on how to address this? It's an issue that has so many different factors. It's an issue that is impossible to address if they're not able to really change the material conditions of the majority of the people in their countries. So that will definitely be on the front of their minds. It will be on the front of probably a lot of their campaign speeches and in the debates. And in Argentina, as we know, in the primary elections, Javier Milei, who, amongst other things, has now gone in rallies with a chainsaw, similar to maybe images that we've seen of Jair Bolsonaro with the machine gun. He is, again, a threat to many, many different things to the people of Argentina, threatening to take away their rights, threatening to cut ministries, to take away the very hard fought for right to abortion. And he continues to poll ahead. He has not grown in any of the polls, but there was a study that was released today by CELAC, the Center for Latin American Geopolitical Studies, and it put Javier Milei at around 31%, followed by Patricia Bullrich, the far-right Macrista kind of tendency, and then in third place, Sergio Massa. Sergio Massa is the current economy minister, and there's been a lot of speculation about when does he become a candidate and stop being an economy minister. It seems like he's really upped his campaign efforts in recent days. Again, he has a very hard road ahead of him in having come in third place, having being very directly associated to the current government, which has a very high disapproval rating. Alberto Fernandez famously did not run for re-election because of this kind of rejection of the people to his government, of course, for many different factors, but one of them being the fact that poverty has increased. Inflation is at record levels. In 2022, it was 100%. So these are kind of the main issues that these candidates are having to contend with. Javier Milei calls for dollarization, Bullrich for more austerity. Again, what is the proposal of the left to deal with these huge, huge challenges?
Very large challenges. Sometimes economic war is also war, and that's what Latin America has faced. But really, there's nothing as bad as war itself. So, Prashant, 6 months in Sudan, which has had a long history of warfare in the past several decades, back to war again. It's hard to call this, Prashant, hard to call it an anniversary. I don't know what word to use.
Absolutely, in the sense that I think also, unlike, say, for instance, the war in Ukraine or whatever, the fact that the war in Sudan has actually fallen off, a lot of the media reports, in fact, reports coming in only when once in a while the United Nations or rights organizations bring out some extremely horrible statistics of what is happening. A classic example was just a couple of days ago. I think the UN sources, mentioned that around 1,200 children had died in refugee camps in Sudan since May, and this is in the White Nile state. And the people the UN experts who talked about this complete collapse of the health infrastructure in the country. I think the latest numbers say that around 80% of all health infrastructure in conflict hit states has been is out of commission, which really throws into throws into sharp light the kind of situation that is taking place. And like I said, the numbers the horrific numbers keep coming. We're talking about around 7,500 deaths and thousands of injuries, and we're talking about millions of people being displaced at this point of time. I think just because of this conflict, we're seeing about 4.1 million people internally displaced, and around 1.1 million people or so displaced into other countries. And this has actually made Sudan the most the highest number of people that have been displaced due to a conflict right now is in Sudan at this point of time, all in this very short span of 6 months. That really kind of shows the intensity of what is taking place in the country right now. And we have a report from our colleague Pawan that gives much more details. But I think the important thing to note is that on the one hand, I think efforts at peace have pretty much completely stalled. There are fresh conflicts breaking out. There have been reports, for instance, of fighting breaking out or tension breaking out in Port Sudan in the east as well, between some tribal communities and the military, who are technically on the same side, so to speak, against the rapid support forces, which is the other side in the war. There is an intense amount of fighting taking place, for instance, in Khartoum, in Darfur. The amount of massive human rights violations and atrocities are, it's an entirely another level altogether. Also, we need to remember that the Darfur region has seen decades or at least years and years of similar atrocities, and this has just escalated during this particular conflict. So in every sense of the term, I think it's by now experts are also, of course, warning of this becoming a kind of conflict which continues for many months, many more months in the future right now. And like I said, very little signs of peace agreements or any discussions of that taking place. So it seems a bit of a it's not definitely not a frozen conflict, but it seems a conflict which might just continue to escalate at this point of time. And I think very important to remember, the fact that the roots of all this lie in the kind of encouragement, the kind of support that these sections of the military got from all the key players in the region, all the the international groupings which wanted to resolve all these issues, kept promoting these generals as the solution, as part of the solution, although the people on the streets had consistently warned that they were going to do exactly this, that they were going to be part of the problem rather than the solution. But their voice was absolutely not heeded. And now we're 6 months into this conflict, we have this massive crisis that is on right now.
Well, this is a very important issue, and you pointed it out directly, Prashant. The question of this is off the radar, and it should not be off the radar. Interestingly, to some extent off the radar, although Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did go on Fox News, there's very little chatter about this negotiation around quote unquote normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, brokered by the United States. It's important to put this in context. A few years ago, during the administration of Donald Trump, there was a real push for normalization. Mr. Trump leaned in on the various monarchies in the Arab world. I think they made a strategic calculation. Forget the Republican kind of governments, whether it's in, Syria, of course, has a whole different history, but even Iraq. They didn't bother with the non-monarchies. They put a lot of pressure on the monarchies, on Bahrain, on the United Arab Emirates, on Morocco. These three countries under the Trump administration, quote unquote, normalized relations with Israel. This was known broadly, particularly the Bahrain and UAE section, as the Abraham Accords. The real prize here is not the UAE and Bahrain, even Morocco. The real prize is Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia, quote unquote, normalizes with Israel, you add in that Egypt and Jordan have already normalized. There'll be immense pressure on countries like Lebanon and so on to follow suit. That's the real prize here. So there was a lot of pressure to get Mohammed bin Salman, who effectively is the only person of importance in the Saudi royal family right now, to accede to the agenda. Well, it's very interesting what the Saudis put on the table. The Saudis put two issues on the table. You see, the Israelis only had one issue: normalization. They want it. They know if Saudi Arabia normalizes, their situation is going to change dramatically. That's all they want. What did the Saudis put on the table? The two main issues. One was improvement of the status of the Palestinians. In other words, something that if you read between the lines looks like a binational civic state of Israel, to absorb the Palestinians in. I think if you look closely at the kind of conversations around normalization, it looks like the Saudis are ready to say the two-state solution is gone, although they don't say it explicitly. But the conditions of the Palestinians have to be improved. That's one. Secondly, Saudi Arabia says, we want the United States to help us build uranium enrichment inside the kingdom. We have uranium. We want to have a nuclear energy program. So therefore, we want uranium enrichment. Interestingly, inside Israel, this has, of course, provoked a debate. Some people argue that the government of Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu would be willing to give Saudi Arabia uranium enrichment, but not allow improvement of status of the Palestinians. That for Mr. Netanyahu is non-negotiable. Sections of the Israeli security apparatus say no chance. Saudi Arabia cannot get uranium enrichment from the US. At the Fox interview, Mr. Mohammed bin Salman was asked about the question of a bomb, because when you talk uranium, you're always going to go in the direction of, is it really for peaceful purposes? And he said, look, if Iran gets a bomb, we want one. Now, in the conversation, nobody said the only person with a bomb right now in the Middle East is Israel. And in fact, Israel is the one that's blocking making the Middle East a nuclear-free zone. Iran is actually quite prepared to sign on to a nuclear-free zone, but they want Israel to also sign on and therefore dismantle their nuclear weapons industry. The thing is that everybody's quite clear, and Mohammed bin Salman winked and indicated this in the interview, that if he doesn't get a nuclear enrichment deal from the United States as part of the normalization package, they're just going to go to Russia or to China to get it. Saudi Arabia is committed to having their own nuclear energy program. They're committed to that. They're going to get it one way or the other. The Americans are desperate to get it as part of this deal. The Israelis are not going to allow it. My God, world history takes place through contradictions. Things are never simple. Here, Saudi Arabia made a deal with Iran. Both of them are joining the BRICS bloc. There is no easy way to move history forward once again. You've been listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's the editors, Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Next week, it's 145th show. just a few shows to 150 guys. We're going to give you a treat on that day. See you later.